The Whispering Hall. There are places where silence is not simply an absence of sound, but a living thing. It breathes. It waits. It coils itself in the corners like dust. That was the silence I walked into the night I first entered the hall. The building was old, centuries older than anything that should still have been standing. Its stone walls bore the stains of time, streaked with damp lines where water had seeped in year after year. The wooden beams sagged as if they carried not just the weight of the roof, but the weight of every memory that had ever clung to that place. The air smelled of rot and old books, of mildew soaked deep into the plaster, and the faint, almost acidic sting of iron. I should not have been there. That much I knew. The hall was closed to the public after dark. The locks were old but firm, yet somehow the door had yielded to my touch that night with an ease that unsettled me, as though something inside had wanted me to enter. The moment the door closed behind me, I felt the difference. The world outside vanished instantly. The faint murmur of wind, the distant splash of water in the canals, the creak of shifting shutters gone. Only the stillness of the hall remained, heavy and impenetrable. I stood there, letting my eyes adjust. The corridor stretched ahead in a long, narrow line, lit only by the moonlight leaking in through small, uneven windows. Dust hung in the air, caught in faint silver beams, drifting slowly like ash. The floor creaked beneath me when I stepped forward, with groaning in protest, echoing far too loudly. The hall had a smell unlike anywhere I had ever been. Damp paper, crumbling mortar, and underneath it all, something faint but unmistakable, the smell of extinguished candles, like smoke clinging to stone. I walked further. My hand brushed along the wall, cold and rough beneath my fingers. The stone was clammy, wet in places, as if it had absorbed the night itself. My footsteps became slower, more hesitant. Each sound I made seemed swallowed almost immediately, but not entirely. There was always a faint suggestion that it lingered just beyond my reach, repeating itself too softly for me to hear. And then it began. A whisper. So soft that at first I thought it was nothing more than the wind pressing through cracks in the masonry. A thin, sibilant rush that came and went. But there was no wind. The air inside the hall was still, stagnant, heavy. The whisper came again, longer this time, too deliberate to be dismissed. I froze where I stood, straining to hear. My heart thudded so loudly it almost drowned out the sound, but the whispering continued, threading its way along the corridor, coiling itself around me. It wasn't a single voice. It was many, overlapping, layered one upon the other. A susurrus of words spoken too softly to decipher, yet somehow carrying intent. I pressed my back against the wall, as if the stone could anchor me, and listened. The whispers rose and fell like breath. Sometimes they hissed quickly, like words spat between clenched teeth. Other times they stretched long and low, mournful, dragging syllables that I could almost feel vibrating in the marrow of my bones. I wanted to turn back, to leave, but the corridor stretched behind me like an abyss, darker now than it had been, as if the shadows had thickened in my absence. The only way forward was deeper into the hall. So I walked. The whispers followed. They did not grow louder, but they grew closer, as though leaning in from just behind my ear, curling their unseen lips into the curve of my neck. I felt the hair rise on my skin, felt my body shiver despite the sweat that had broken across it. The air grew heavier, pressing into my lungs, filling me with the taste of dust and damp stone. At one point, I passed a doorway. The wood of the frame was warped, splintered, eaten away with age. Moonlight spilled across the threshold, and for just a moment, I thought I saw movement inside. A shifting of the shadows, a sliver of pale shape retreating out of sight. The whispers surged when I looked, louder, angrier, until I forced myself to move on. The hall narrowed as I went further. The ceiling seemed to descend, the walls pressing closer, though I knew it was only my fear reshaping the space. My fingertips grazed both sides now, stone cold on one side, wood damp on the other. The whispers changed. They became words, not in a language I understood, but in a rhythm, a cadence that felt intentional. A chant. The syllables were jagged, harsh, tumbling over each other, filling the space with a sound that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. My teeth ached with it. My vision wavered. The shadows moved even when I stood perfectly still. And then the whispers stopped. The silence returned. But it was not the same silence I had felt when I first entered. This was thicker, total. Even my breath seemed absorbed before it left my lips. I could not hear the beat of my own heart. I could not hear the blood in my ears. It was as if I had been cast into a void where sound could no longer exist. I wanted to scream just to break it, but no voice came. And then, in that absolute silence, I felt it. A breath, against my ear, warm, slow. The whisper came once more. Only this time, it was not many voices. It was one. It said nothing I could recognize, and yet I understood. It was not a word, but a command, a pull, an invitation. The air grew colder around me. My skin tightened. My eyes burned as if a weight pressed against them, forcing me to look into the darkness ahead. And in that darkness, shapes stirred, shadows that did not belong to the walls. They shifted, unfurled, rose taller than the corridor should have allowed. I stumbled backward, my shoulder striking stone, and the whisper grew harsh, angry, the voice twisting into a sound so sharp it cut through the silence like glass breaking. I ran. My feet struck the wood, each step exploding like thunder in the void. The corridor stretched endlessly before me, lengthening with every stride, the doorway shrinking further and further away. The whispers chased me, screaming now, not words but sound, layered and furious, 100 voices tearing at me from every side. I burst through the door into the cold night air, and the sound vanished instantly. The silence outside was ordinary again. The city's noises returned, distant footsteps, a shutter banging, water shifting in the canal. The hall stood behind me, mute and still, as though nothing had happened. And yet, even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it, the faintest whisper curling into my ear, reminding me that the silence is never empty. It is only waiting. the stains that never fade. There are certain places where time itself feels arrested, where no amount of restoration, no polish or paint, no fresh wood or stone can quite mask what has sunk deep into the bones of a building. The Hall of Justice was such a place. It was no longer a court, not anymore. For centuries it had seen trials, condemnations, punishments, and the final moments of those unfortunate enough to pass beneath its vaulted ceiling. Now, it stood as a museum, a relic of the city's history. Visitors came in daylight, murmuring about architecture and heritage, cameras clicking against the carved stone walls. But at night, when the doors closed and the echo of footsteps vanished, something remained. I had gone inside after hours, part of a sanctioned tour, though by the end I wished I had never stepped across the threshold. The air hit me first. Even before I adjusted to the dim interior, I smelled it. Dry dust mixed with something faintly metallic, like iron that had long since rusted yet refused to disappear. There was a sweetness beneath it too, cloying, rotten, as though the stones themselves exhaled centuries of decay. The chamber was lit only by a scattering of weak bulbs along the walls. Their glow was yellow, unsteady, casting long shadows that pooled in the corners. The floor stretched out in front of me, stone slabs worn smooth by countless feet. In the center, darker patches marred the surface. They spread irregularly, jagged around the edges, their deep brown-black color sunken into the stone. At first glance, they might have been water stains. That's what the guide said when people asked in daylight. But standing there in the near silence, the truth pressed harder. They weren't water. I stepped closer, my shoes scuffing lightly against the stone, and crouched down to look. The stains weren't flat. They were sunken, as though the very surface had been eaten away, seeped into, leaving a faint depression. I ran my fingertips near one edge. The stone was rougher there, uneven, as though it had been gnawed at by something far older than time. The room carried a chill that had nothing to do with air temperature. It sank into me slowly, creeping from the base of my spine outward. It was the kind of cold that makes you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat, of the hollow echo of your breath. I forced myself to keep moving, circling the chamber. My eyes kept dragging back to the floor, though, to the stains. The further I walked, the more I realized they weren't confined to one area. They dotted the stones across the hall, some large and sprawling, others small and circular, like droplets scattered from some forgotten spill. I paused at the largest one. It stretched across nearly half the slab, twisting into an almost human shape. My throat tightened as the thought occurred to me, like someone had lain there once, still and heavy, while the stone drank deep of what poured from them. The lamps above buzzed faintly, their filaments straining, and in the flickering light, the stains seemed darker, glistening faintly. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was flat again, dull, dry, lifeless. The silence was not absolute here. There were sounds, but none I could place. A faint scratching, like nails drawn across stone. A sigh, deep in the walls, as though the building itself was exhaling. I told myself it was old wood shifting, the ancient foundation settling. But the longer I listened, the less it sounded like structure and more like intention. The stains were not only on the floor. I saw them on the lower parts of the walls, smeared, as though dragged upward by hands or cloth. Some stretched higher, curling across the stone in streaks. I leaned closer, studying one, and that was when I caught it, an odor stronger than before. Metallic, sharp, copper, blood. The words surfaced in my mind unbidden, undeniable. I backed away quickly, my breath quickening, but the smell lingered. No worse. It grew. Each inhale filled me with it, like I was standing in the aftermath of something fresh, as though the stains beneath me had never dried at all. My head spun. I staggered toward one of the benches along the wall and sat down, forcing myself to breathe slowly. My pulse hammered against my temples. I shut my eyes for only a moment. When I opened them, the stains had spread. It wasn't possible. I knew that, yet the shapes had grown darker, larger, crawling outward across the floor like ink dropped into water. Their edges reached further toward me, stretching like fingers. I pressed my palms against my eyes, blinked hard, and looked again. The stains were as they had been, dull, ancient, but the vision remained imprinted in my mind, the image of them reaching. A sound drifted through the hall then, soft and wet, like liquid dripping steadily onto stone. I turned my head sharply, scanning the chamber, but nothing moved. The sound continued, steady, rhythmic. Drip, drip, drip. It came from everywhere at once. From the floor, from the walls, from the ceiling above. The air grew heavier, thick with the stench of iron, until I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve. My eyes watered, and then I saw it. One of the stains near the center was not flat any longer. It gleamed, dark and wet, as though the stone had begun to bleed anew. The surface rippled faintly, catching the meager light. I couldn't move. My body locked in place, frozen between terror and disbelief. The wetness spread slowly, pooling outward in a thin film. I watched as it trickled toward the nearest seam in the stones, sinking down, vanishing, only to be replaced by more. It was endless. The dripping grew louder, heavier. It was no longer the sound of liquid falling. It was the sound of something being wrung out, something emptied. The walls around me seemed to darken. Shadows crawled higher, stretching unnaturally, distorting the shapes of the benches and the carvings overhead. The buzzing lamps dimmed, casting everything in a faint, orange glow that made the stains seem blacker, more alive. I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the cold stone wall. My breath came shallow, uneven. My heart felt like it would tear itself apart. The stains pulsed. I swear they did. A faint shiver passed through them, as though something beneath the surface still beat with life. And then the whispers came. Not loud, not distinct. Just the faintest murmur rising from the stone, carried on the stink of rust and rot. They were too many to count, layered upon each other, but they shared a rhythm. Low, steady chanting. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound seeped through, vibrating in my skull, echoing in my chest. The stains brightened in the dying light, gleaming wet, spreading outward in slow, deliberate tendrils. That was when I broke. I ran. I don't remember the door opening, don't remember my feet striking the steps outside. I only remember the taste of night air, sharp and clean. the way my lungs burned as though I had been drowning and had finally surfaced. When I looked back, the hall was dark, silent. The stains were invisible from the doorway, hidden in shadow. But even now, years later, I can still see them when I close my eyes. I can smell them. And sometimes in the dead of night, when I wake to silence too deep for comfort, I swear I hear it again. The dripping, the sound of stains that never fade.